And welcome, everybody. Welcome to our seventh installment of our legislative series for the North Dallas Chamber. We're pleased to see so many friends in attendance today. Special thanks to Ross Ramsey for being our speaker. I'm going to turn it over to our past board chair, Charles Elk, with Encore. Encore is one of the sponsors of this program, and Charles is going to kick us off. So, Charles, thanks very much.
Jeff. Thanks, Ken. And I would just say thank you to the team who put this series together. You know, this started off as being in lieu of an in-person trip to Austin, and I think it has turned into something that is just truly outstanding. This would be our seventh session of this in this series, and we are delighted to welcome Ross Ramsey, who is certainly no stranger to Dallas and no stranger, thankfully, to the North Dallas Chamber. He's been with us on a number of occasions, and we're appreciative certainly of that. And I would ask, so Ross is, of course, the co-founder and executive editor of the Texas Tribune. And Ross, we might ask you to say a word, if you don't mind, right up on the upfront about the Texas Tribune and the business model of which you spoke just a moment ago. But Ross is I guess he worked for state government maybe 2 years or so, but other than that, he spent a career in journalism, and I guess you might say over that period of time, journalism has transformed, and probably Ross has transformed it at some level, at least with regard to process. But Ross, we're delighted to have you with us, and without anything further, so as to give you as much time as possible, thank you, sir, for joining us.
Well, I'm flattered to be asked back. In the interest of Zoom meetings everywhere, the guy next door has a crew out running a weed eater. So if you hear the blower and the weed eater, just pretend it's your house. The Texas Tribune we started 11 years ago. Actually, 3 of us started knocking it around as kind of a maybe exercise. We weren't necessarily going to start a business back in November of 2008. It turned into a business plan. We threw the switch on November of 2009 on what would have been election day if that had been an election year, and have never looked back. It's prospered. It's done really well. It's very flattering. The idea of the thing was to create a really deep state house bureau that covered public policy, politics, government, and statewide issues. We had an idea that we would have a certain number of people. We're almost 100 people now. If we were downtown where we're supposed to be, we were a floor of a downtown office building right by the Texas Capitol. And it's been a really thriving thing. We're an unusual model. We're a nonprofit. When we started looking at this, of course, we all had visions of getting rich. That's a hard thing to do in media right now. And we decided, after looking at it and poking around, not to start a for-profit model, but instead to do a nonprofit model with a big events component. A lot of it works, like public media always does, viewers like you, listeners like you, readers like you, big grants, things like that. And it's really thrived. And I think the lesson of it, and the thing that I was most curious about when we started this, was whether Texans were really still interested in these things. A lot of the papers had pulled back, not because they weren't interested and not because they weren't really good at this, but because, this has been a really tough business and they were having to give up things in order to keep some things going. So if you're going to cover City Hall, maybe you need to pull back a little bit on some of your bureaus and things like that. When I came to Austin in 1989 for the old Dallas Times-Herald, may she rest in peace, there were about 97, or rather 95 credentialed journalists from all over the state covering the Texas Capitol. When Evan and John Thornton and I started talking about the Tribune just as an idea, there were about 27. And that's happened all over the country, Springfield, Sacramento, Albany, everywhere you could go. And the idea was that there's still plenty of news here. There's not enough ants at the picnic. Let's hire some ants and get to work. And we did, and here we are. So that's the Texas Tribune. We'd love to have you be members, but more importantly than that, we'd love to have you go read what we write, go see how we report. It's free. It's out there for everybody. And the idea is that we give you as much as we can about what you need if you want to get things done in civics and in government and in politics. So that's my spiel. My other spiel is there's a legislative session going on kind of incredibly in the middle of a pandemic. You know, a legislature, like a city council or a commissioner's court or anything else, is kind of a live social network. And it's interesting to try to conduct a legislative session that would normally put, you know, I think at peak capacity, something like 6,000 people inside the state capitol. It's interesting to do that during a pandemic, and to do that with social distancing, and to do it with masks, and to take away a lot of the very things that make this work. You know, a lot of law happens in, like a lot of business happens, a lot of things happen just in happenstance meetings, in hallway conversation, in reactions to things people weren't expecting. You know, there's this whole interesting brew that comes together in a legislative session and allows the legislature in 140 days in a normal legislative year to file 6,000 or 7,000 pieces of legislation and to pass 1,800 to 2,000 of them into law. It's really kind of incredible. They do a $250 billion budget. They do big issues, you know, that you hear about. They do a gazillion little issues that are really important to people that you don't hear about. You know, that community over there gets a low water crossing. This one over there gets a new water treatment plant. All of those things are trying to go on during this very, very difficult period. It's been a very weird session. It started very quietly. Ordinarily, the first day of a session is a bunch of people at the Capitol grounds. You know, there's a table set up over here for this group and a group gathered around something else. There are always, because we live in Texas, guys walking around in camo with assault rifles that are somehow for all of that only vaguely threatening. It's always a scene. This year, it was not a scene at all. And that was the beginning of the legislative session. We went several weeks before the House and Senate were organized, as we always do. But one of the things that happened this time was we just came out of an election where the people who went to the Texas legislature weren't necessarily going to the legislature with a list of things that they wanted to do, and that was going to be the agenda of the session. This time we had a list of things that they had to do that were sort of dealt them. You know, nobody in the legislature came down here campaigning on how to behave during a pandemic, or on what to do if we have a freeze that sweeps the whole state at the same time and shuts down electricity for everybody and kills 200 people or more. The things that happened in this legislative session, or that are the central issues of this legislative session, are super important to Texans, super important to legislators, but they're not things that the legislature chose. So we're not seeing, you know, the same kind of fabric that we usually see, where someone's trying to persuade someone else, no, really, you need to do this, you really need to do that. Some of that going on, but it's different this time. Some of the issues as we go into this, we are 6 weeks already from the end of the legislative session. And I can talk about these at length. We can do a lot of this in a question session at the end of this. We're still talking about casinos. The Las Vegas Sands Corporation is sort of leading the charge this time. They have, at last check, 61 lobbyists, which is kind of incredible. I know the lobbyists are really happy about it because you get to share the workload with 59 or 60 of your friends. The legislator to lobby ratio on that is 3 to 1, which is, you know, pretty good odds if you're a casino. Las Vegas Sands is going to start a big ad campaign, and they're trying to expand to destination casinos, as they call them, in Texas. This is one of a number of issues that would have been doing better right now if the state was in financial trouble. Every time in Texas that we've done parimutuel gambling or bingo or the lottery has been a time when the state needed money. And part of the pitch was, if you let us do, for example, a state lottery, it'll cover, you know, the first billion or so of your public education expenses. So that's been one of the ways they sold these. I think the casino folks thought, like a lot of us thought before this session began, that this was going to be a year when the legislature was scrambling for money. They're not, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Nevertheless, the casino push is still on. They're buying a bunch of ads. The lieutenant governor has said, basically, not in my house, but they're going to try anyhow. Constitutional carry is an issue I didn't think was going to work this time. It's basically the right to carry a handgun without a permit, without a license. They call it constitutional carry because their idea is the only permit you should need is the Constitution. That's obviously their marketing pitch. It worked in the House. They've got it passed last week. It's on its way to the Senate. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick said this morning he doesn't have the votes yet in the Senate, and he won't bring it up until he does. So we'll see how that issue goes. Some of these things have to do with COVID and what my friend Evan Smith calls snowvid, the freeze and the outages that we had. The Senate has passed a bill that would put a 30-day limit on executive orders during emergencies. So a governor could step in during a hurricane or a tornado or a freeze or whatever and say, I'm going to institute these executive orders for 30 days. If it went longer than that, it would require legislative approval of some kind. And obviously this is targeted at the orders that Greg Abbott was giving during the months of the pandemic that started in March of last year and ran all the way up until the beginning of the legislative session. At that point, the legislature was here and it was a little bit more collaborative. But until then, it was in some ways a one-man show. He put together panels on medicine and panels on hospitals and panels on, this and that business. But it was still a one-man show. And some of the legislators, both from the right and from the left, think that that was too much and that the legislature ought to be involved. So they're working on that. They're doing a budget like they always do. And this goes back to the money thing. When we were at this point last year, I interviewed Glenn Hager, the state controller, for a half hour in a Zoom call, actually, about what the economy looked like. He was one of the first people to use the word recession in association with the coronavirus. And he was saying, I'm not putting a number on it yet, but I'm telling legislators that they're going to be billions and billions dollars short of the budget that we're in right now, and that they were going to have problems in the budget that followed. By midsummer, he put a number on it, $4.6 billion shortfall in the current budget. But then the economy started to come back much faster than he expected, much faster than a lot of people expected. By the time we got to the legislative session, it was down to $1 billion shortfall, and it was shrinking. And the outlook for the next 2 years looked pretty good. So one of the things that carried Texas through was the last legislature passed some laws that made it easier for the state to tax online sales in the same way that they tax brick and mortar sales. As we switched, because of the pandemic, to an online economy in a lot of ways, that really paid off, at least in terms of the state budget, state revenue, city and county revenue that's based on sales taxes as well. So the budget right now looks pretty good, and it's about $250 billion. The legislature was looking at some other things that they were going to balance it with. I mentioned casinos. There was a lot of talk about legalizing marijuana, and maybe that would produce some money. There was a lot of talk about getting into the state's rainy day fund, which is essentially, a savings account. And there was a lot of talk about Medicaid expansion. Medicaid expansion is a federal program. It's part of Obamacare, the American, the ACA. All of a sudden, all I can remember is the acronym. But the idea is that the state puts up a dime and gets back $1 in a match. It's a really beneficial program that way. Texas has been one of a number of conservative states that resisted taking part in it because they were, among other things, for fear of strings that were attached to the money and for fear that they were starting the state and the federal government down a road that would become more and more expensive and would just become another entitlement. Whatever your politics are on that, Texas has not opted into that. It's now one of just a few states. I think it's about a dozen, 12 or 14 states that don't have Medicaid expansion. Some of the most conservative states in the country have gone along with it now. Arkansas, Missouri, Idaho being the most recent ones to jump in. And there was a lot of conversation among Republicans and Democrats before the session started about whether we should go into Medicaid expansion this time because the budget was so bad, because we were in a pandemic that obviously increased medical pressure on the state, which still has the highest number and highest percentage of uninsured people of any state in the country, and because we were facing these budget problems. And as the budget problems have dwindled, and as the latest surge in the coronavirus has receded, that pressure has eased up. And it looked, if I'd been giving this speech a week ago, I would say I wouldn't put too many of my beans on the chance of Medicaid expansion passing. But then on Friday, the Biden administration denied what's called an 1115 waiver to the state, and basically said they were not going to extend a set of special conditions around federal Medicaid money that Texas was benefiting from. And Texas would need to do something else. They need to revise that waiver and reapply, or they need to expand Medicaid. But from a state standpoint, there are a bunch of politics involved, and I won't get into all of that. But I will say that, in terms of dollars, it puts a big giant hole in the state's Medicaid budget, and they have to figure out how to fill it. I would expect that there are going to be lawsuits. They're already talking about that. I would expect that they're going to file a revised waiver request. And I would expect that, the talk of Medicaid expansion will come back around. It's not an immediate problem. I'm trying to remember, the HHSC says, the state agency in charge of this says that it'll be September of 2022 before this money runs out, before this waiver runs out. So there's a little bit of time here, but the legislature's leaving, like I said, in about 6 weeks, and you're not going to have time for the legislature to deal with it even between now and 2022, unless they came back in a special session. So maybe Medicaid expansion is back on the plan. There's a bunch of federal money that came in. This was the other thing that made the budget much easier for the state. The Trump administration had 2 COVID relief packages. The Biden administration, as you know, had one of its own that dwarfs the other 2. It's a huge plan, and it includes $16.7 billion for the state itself, $3.4 billion for large cities, $5.7 billion for counties in Texas, and $17.9 billion for public and higher education. So there's a ton of money pouring in. It's one-time money, so you can't use it for budgeting and such. But there are a lot of things that, for example, the schools want to do. The leading one of which is addressing learning loss. When we started telling kids this time last year, you're going to get your education at the kitchen table on a Chromebook or on a tablet, we started to experience learning loss. And I'm sure you guys have either personal experience or a bunch of friends with this experience. The anecdotal evidence and the accumulated evidence is the same. A bunch of kids are not where they would be had we not had a pandemic and had we not sent them home. They've lost some ground in the same way that kids lose ground in the summer when you send them home and they come back in September and you got to put another quarter in the machine and teach them their multiplication tables again. We've got a really long version of that going on right now. And it's dire if you don't attack it and get on it very quickly. The school districts want to do it right now, this summer. They're kind of knocking on the state's door. Some of them are kicking to get the state to let the money loose and send it down so that they can get the learning loss programs going as quickly as possible. The particular concern here is for kids who are at that stage of learning where they're getting real building blocks that they're going to use throughout their education careers, learning how to add, learning how to subtract, reading, writing, arithmetic, all of those things. Those kids who are in that developmental stage need to be caught up quick, or they not only lose this year, they're behind in 6th grade and 7th grade and 8th grade and so on. So there's a lot of noise around that money. There's a state idea that maybe this should be a state program run by the Texas Education Agency, doled out by the governor. There's another idea that the money should go straight to the 1,200 or so school districts in Texas and charter schools. And there's another idea that the legislature should have a panel that so that the governor and the TEA commissioner can come back and dole the money out, but only with legislative approval. The panel would be governor, lieutenant governor, and the chairs and vice chairs of the two budget committees on either side. There's a lot floating around with that. We have a lot of legislation. In fact, a lot of it is up in the House as we speak today around the outages that were so devastating to Texas in February. We weren't ready for this storm, and a lot of people argue that we should have been ready for this storm because we had a storm in your part of the state in 2011 that did pretty much the same thing. We got a hard freeze that lasted several days. It took out electrical generation and also took out some of the fuel sources to electric generators, left a bunch of people in North Texas in blackouts, outages for days. The same thing happened this time, except it was on a statewide level. And as demand rose because of the weather, supply fell because of the weather. And it was because a lot of the things that were recommended after that 2011 storm were never really implemented. There was a conversation back there 10 years ago about weatherizing electric generating plants so that they didn't freeze up, about weatherizing some of the natural gas suppliers and some of the coal suppliers so that even if so that we didn't lose power, even if the electrical generation plants were on because they couldn't get fuel. Instead of requiring that 10 years ago, we recommended it and suggested it. And, it's an expensive proposition and it didn't happen. And it didn't happen on a scale that left us with the problem that we had in 2021. This time, I learned many years ago not to predict what the Texas legislature will do, but I can tell you that their constituents are plenty mad at them and want this fixed. And if politicians are nothing else, they're responsive to angry constituents. So I think something will happen. We'll see exactly what it is. I think if it is short of requiring some kind of weatherization, then we're going to have these same problems again. The next question behind that is if I require a bunch of plants to weatherize or I require a bunch of gas suppliers to weatherize, who's going to pay for that? And it kind of comes down to a question, if you do this in gross terms, do you want to pay for it as a taxpayer or do you want to pay for it as an electric ratepayer? And that means, do the companies pay for it or does the state pay for it? I think with some of this COVID money and with some of this federal relief that's pouring in, there's a chance that the state can securitize this as a one-time expense and maybe get done some of the things they talked about doing in 2011 and maybe help us stay out of all of these kinds of problems in the future. There's a bunch of governance issues around the freeze that I'm sure you've heard about. A lot of us had never heard of ERCOT 3 or 4 months ago. Now everybody knows that ERCOT is the controller of the Texas grid. A lot of people weren't sure what a grid was 3 months ago. Now they know what a grid is. So there's going to be some change in the governance of ERCOT. There's going to be some change in the governance of the Public Utility Commission, not only in the people who were there. All 3 commissioners who were in that agency on Valentine's Day are gone. 2 of them have been replaced. There's 1 more appointment pending. So we're changing that. The legislature is looking at its network of laws and its protections or the lack of them against these kinds of things. And then there's some wild cards. You guys have probably heard that Berkshire Hathaway's electric generation subsidiary wants to come to Texas, get a flat fee added to all of our bills so that they can build 10 big plants that would kick in whenever we have a situation like we had in February. I don't know if that's going to fly. I didn't think it was going to come to a vote, but it's moving in committee. So we'll see how that goes. The same people who are pushing for that, and I'll just mention this because Warren Buffett's one of the people who's doing this. The legislature wants to change the state's voting laws. You've no doubt been reading about this battle. If you are on one side, you call this election integrity and say we're just trying to tighten up all of the things that we think might go wrong in a future election that might, lead people not to trust the results. If you're on the other side, you say the things that you're talking about are voter suppression. You're making it harder to vote by mail. You're shortening the time for voting early. You're getting rid of drive-through voting like they did in Houston during the pandemic. you're no doubt reading about that fight, and you're no doubt reading about or hearing about, maybe even participating in some of the corporate reaction to those voting laws. Started in Georgia, it has now spread to Texas, where you've got companies like American Airlines, Dell Computer, saying that they don't support these changes to voting laws and weighing in as corporations. One of those is Warren Buffett, which is going to make it interesting if and when the Berkshire Hathaway electric bill gets to the floor and gets in front of all of the Republicans who have been upset that some of these corporations are activated in the way that they're activated. We still have a bunch of policing stuff. If we hadn't had a pandemic and we hadn't had a freeze and hadn't had a recession, we would still be talking about policing in America, and in particular in Texas. George Floyd was from Texas. The governor went to visit George Floyd's family after his death in Minneapolis, and said at the time that he would support the George Floyd Act if it got to the floor of the legislature. And here we are. It's at the floor of the legislature. So one of the big remaining debates before this legislature, one of the big issues is all of the stuff around police behavior, police treatment of Black and Latino suspects in particular, police training, whether we're asking police to do things we shouldn't be asking police to do. There's an old line that is unfortunately true in Houston, that the largest mental health institution in the state of Texas is the Harris County Jail. So you have questions like, should that be run by police? Should that be run by mental health professionals? Should that be run by some combination of the two? Some people have reduced this to the slogan, defund the police. That gets a sharp reaction from a lot of people across the political spectrum, a sharp negative reaction, I should say. So there are a lot of issues around this, and a lot of issues that have been stirred up by this, and they get re-stirred up every week. And I think the legislature is going to be dealing with that either now or for a long time as we go into the future. We thought at the beginning of the session, maybe a year ago, that the theme of this session would be redistricting, which is, if you're interested in politics, it's fascinating. They get the census numbers, they draw the political maps. If you're not interested in politics, it's frustrating, because this is like if your legislator was a dog and this issue was a squirrel. Your dog's going to be distracted during the whole legislative session. When they're working on redistricting, you always have the feeling when you're talking to a legislator that while you're talking to them, they're kind of looking over your shoulder to see if there's somebody more interesting to talk to behind you. The redistricting got put off because the census got put off. The pandemic delayed the count. The numbers that ordinarily would be available around March 30th won't be ready until September 30th. And without those numbers, you can't redo the maps. So that means that we're going to redo the maps probably in October or November here in Texas. It takes that issue out of the legislative session. And we're getting into the part of the calendar where we're going to start to affect the 2022 election cycle. As it stands on paper right now, the candidates who want to run for office in 2022 have to file, I don't have the date in my head, but it's mid-December of this year. And then the primary is on March 1st. If you aren't drawing the political maps until October and November, it's going to be really hard to ask people, do you want to run for this seat that we haven't created yet? You're going to push back the filing deadline. You're going to push back the primaries. You're going to push back the primary runoffs. And the only date that can't move is the general election date in November. So I'm expecting right now for the primary elections to be pushed back and to be a little bit late, because redistricting is getting pushed back and will be a little bit late. It frees the legislature right now, and we'll see. But they'll be back in special session. What that means, as you know, is if they're back in special session, there will be probably 15 or 20 of the state's 180 state legislators really deeply involved in redistricting. And the rest of them, for at least part of that time, will be idle, looking for something to do. So that means there's probably going to be a bunch of other legislation sometime in autumn and into the winter. I think you ought to have your eyes open for that if you want something, or if you're trying to prevent something. Some of the things that don't get out of this session will arise several months later as zombies, and so you ought to be aware of that. The Snowvid stuff I mostly talked about. One of the things to mention there is that the governor said after the outages and freeze in February that he was not going to let the legislature leave until they had dealt with this problem. There's a lot of room in the two words "dealt with," but I think the chance of the legislature doing nothing and getting away with it are pretty much zero. So there's an outside chance that they don't get done all the things the governor wants done on this and that he calls them back right away. Chris Patty, who's from Marshall, Texas, is the head of the committee that's been handling this stuff. And he was cautioning members the other day to get it moving or to get ready to not take the kids to Disneyland this year. So keep your eye on that space. The COVID stuff that I think we still have to do, the powers of the governor seem to be the big issue. There are a lot of issues that came out of this that have been around before. If you've watched the legislature for years, you know that they've been talking for years about broadband, and in particular about broadband internet in rural Texas. Now that we do school on that and a lot of our work on that, a lot of our medicine on that, it's become evident that we're not just trying to get Netflix for rural Texas. We're trying to get all of the regular things, and that this really is infrastructure. It has also brought to the fore another accessibility problem, and that is that some of the people in urban Texas who have fiber optic cable or high-speed cable right out there at the curb can't afford it. And if you're going to require it as a way to go to school, you've got to figure out how to get it into those houses as well. There's some federal money for that. The legislature is talking seriously about that this time. It's one of the issues that the pandemic has really pressed upon us and gotten moving. The last thing I want to mention, and it really is the last thing that I want to mention, but we have to mention it, is the 2022 elections and the 2024 elections. Because the people who participate in those things are already talking about this stuff, believe it or not. We have a pile of people that are talking about or saying they will run in 2022. As you know, the big offices, governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, controller, the big executive offices are on the ballot this year. Greg Abbott says he's going to run again. Dan Patrick says he's going to run again. Dan Patrick says he's not going to run against Greg Abbott. Ken Paxton is a giant question mark. He's got a 5.5-year-old indictment hanging over him on securities fraud. And he's got an FBI investigation that was spurred by 6 of his top aides blowing the whistle on him and saying he was using his public office for the benefit of a private donor. We'll see how that goes, but that's not the kind of thing you want to talk about if you're running for office. George P. Bush, the land commissioner, has already said he's considering a run for attorney general, whether or not Ken Paxton is there. Matthew McConaughey is knocking around. Sid Miller, the agriculture commissioner, was one of the people who gathered outside of the governor's mansion with megaphones to protest Greg Abbott's shutdown of private businesses during the pandemic. So there's some noise inside the party there. If you like politics, it just goes on and on and on. So that's what's happening for 2022. Those guys are lining up. As I said, those elections, at least the first part of them, will probably be delayed. And we've got conversation about 2024. You're starting to see people maneuver for within the Republican Party to figure out whether the next nominee is going to be Donald Trump or somebody just like him or somebody exactly not like him. The Democrats are quietly, much more quietly, because they've got an incumbent president, moving around because a lot of them don't think that the incumbent president will be the candidate next time around, mostly because of his age. So, you're starting to see those people move around. If you're a voter, you don't see that really at all. If you are associated with, or you are a really rich person who's interested in politics, you're probably getting some phone calls already. The animals are out in the grass. So as you go through the rest of the legislative session and the rest of the year, you probably need to know that those animals in the grass are out there. So I'll leave it there. Like I said, that's the last thing I wanted to talk about. We've got a few minutes here if anybody has any questions we want to go through.
Wow, Ross, thank you so much. That was a tremendous summary of everything that's happening right now in the session. And normally when we do these, I've got a long list of 10 or 15 questions and topics that I want to cover. And I think you covered almost every single topic that I had in my list of questions. And so well done. Thank you very much. You've done a
That's
tremendous
great.
job
That's
of
like
updating.
passing my version of the STAR test. That's great.
You definitely passed. I still do have some questions for you, but also want to let the attendees know, if you've got a question for Ross, please post it in the chat or send it to me privately. For those of you who've attended our forums and programs before, you know that we like to call on you to ask the questions as opposed to me just reading them out. So if you've got questions for Ross, please let me know or put them in the chat. But Ross, I want to start off with Medicaid expansion. I know you talked about that, but that's been our priority issue for the session. We've been working with State Senator Nathan Johnson and the North Texas Commission. I see Charlene Stark here as well, to try to get that passed. And we've had, at times we thought, yeah, there's actually a chance this might happen. Other times we seem pretty down on it. Based on what happened on Friday, tell us now, where would you assess the chances of Medicaid expansion passing? And if it passes, what does that look like?
I'm very careful not to predict what the legislature is going to do. The Medicaid expansion is one of those things that if you could figure out how to delabel this, you know how a wine tasting works when they don't tell you which one you're drinking, but they tell you that one of these wines is from the Bordeaux region of France and one of them is from Lubbock, Texas. And if you have a label on it, you're probably going to go for the Bordeaux. But it might be that if the labels are off, you'd go for Lubbock. And Medicaid expansion is a little bit like that. I think if you could take the Obamacare label off of it, or the ACA label, or whatever label you want to put on it, and put it in front of the legislature and say, okay, look, we've got this Medicaid program. It's a deal where if we put up $1, they put up $10, and all the other states are doing it. So one of the arguments here is you have more uninsured than any other place in the country. You have a higher percentage of uninsured than any other place in the country. You should do this. All of the conservative and liberal, but mostly conservative doctors and hospitals in the state of Texas are telling the legislature, and have been telling the legislature for years, don't be idiots, do this. You're putting a bunch of money in the economy. This all works. And I think if it didn't have the label of a Democratic president's big plan, we probably would have done it. We've had a bunch of Republicans try to do it. John Zerwas, who was the Republican chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, really took a hard swing at this a few years ago and got turned down in the House. I think the chances of this are hard unless you do some version of delabeling of your own. You've got to figure out some way to call it something else. There's been a conversation over the years about putting together something called the Texas Plan, which is basically you apply for Medicaid expansion as a form of a waiver. I'm not talking about the 1115 waiver now, but you take some kind of a waiver, you call it the Texas Plan, and it operates like the Medicaid expansion, maybe without some of the strings, maybe without the match. There's another thing now that's an enhancer here. The Biden administration put a sweetener in its COVID package that says for states that have not yet signed up for Medicaid expansion, it's a sweeter match if you jump right now. It's like a Crazy Eddie stereo sale or something. But they're trying to make it attractive enough that even the Texases will come along. I thought it was semi-compelling when Arkansas and Idaho and Missouri came along, but apparently not yet. They're working on it, is really the only thing I can say. There have been a couple of times in the past where I thought they might pass it. Now that the federal government has turned down this 1115 waiver, which is also Medicaid, but it's a little bit different area, the incentive for Texas to find some money somewhere and get these people served is really, really strong. And it may be that, I don't know this, I'm speculating that the federal government said they wouldn't renew this particular waiver as a bargaining chip to get Texas into a conversation, not only about a different kind of 1115 waiver, but about this Texas Plan or Medicaid expansion. I'm an optimist, but I also know that the resistance to Medicaid expansion has been really strong. So we'll see how it goes.
Very much. And I think your point about relabeling it is well taken. We've had conversations with a number of Republican legislators about it, and they all seem to be more supportive of decreasing the number of uninsured Texans as opposed to calling it Medicaid expansion. So we've tried to do a better job of reframing it as such.
And there are a couple of pretty good Lubbock wines now. So, there's a chance.
Yeah, if you've got recommendations on wines, Lubbock or otherwise, go ahead and put those in the chat. Ross, talk to us a little bit about some of the voter rights and voter access and some of those bills and what you see happening there.
I think this is just a classic partisan fight in the legislature. The Republicans outnumber the Democrats. We had a debate that the architecture of the debate was the same. The issues were a little bit different, but you remember the voter ID bill a few years ago. The Democrats resisted it. I think the final votes were straight party lines or very close to straight party lines, Republicans for, Democrats against, and it went to court. The legislation the legislature passed the first time was too strong for the courts, and the courts said, this is unconstitutional. They came back, they ended up with a voter ID law that didn't go as far as the Republicans originally wanted to go, but any voter ID law was anathema to Democrats. So I think some of the same issues are happening here. This fight has gotten labeled differently and as an extension of, accusations about whether the elections were fair in 2020, about whether this is an attempt to suppress votes, in particular from people of color. And, it just has a lot of extra baggage on it and a lot of extra political baggage on it. I expect this to, I'm not going to be surprised if either the House bill or the Senate bill, I think it's HB 7 and SB 6 or vice versa, get out of the legislature. If they do, I think the governor will sign it, and I think we're going straight to court. This interference or involvement, or whatever you want to call it, activism from corporations has really thrown the legislature off a little bit, and as it's thrown off Congress a little bit. And I think that's an interesting twist in this conversation. But I think this legislature really wants to pass something. We did a poll, I'll just say it on the side, we did some polling on this and said, I think this is close to the question we asked. Do you think the results of the last national elections were accurate and fair? And we asked the same thing about the last elections in Texas being accurate and fair. And the basic bottom line is a lot more people think the Texas elections were fair than think the national elections were fair. And it's a partisan split. The Republicans were much less trustworthy of the national elections. They were much more trustworthy of the state elections. They lost one, they won one.
Thanks very much. Last question for me before we go to attendee questions. Tell us about some of the under the radar bills that you've been tracking. We've been following, example, HB 2315, which is the increased penalties for street racing, or HB 2558, which would potentially restrict the ability of cities to contract with businesses that have discriminatory language against firearms producers. We're opposed to that one. We're in favor of the street racing legislation. HB 4072, which addresses some of these sales tax concerns. But are there any things that, anything a little under the radar that you've been tracking that hasn't been getting a lot of attention?
There's one that some of you are, I'm sure, hyper aware of, and some of you haven't even heard of. The 313 exemptions on school property taxes are up for sunset this year. If the legislature does nothing, those disappear. It was a point of controversy before we started the corporate conversation about voting, and I'll come back to that. But these are basically, if I'm in a community and Intergalactic Garage Tech wants to build a new plant and they're shopping around for places to build it, this is the program that allows a school district to say, we'll give you a 10-year exemption if you create this many jobs and if you do these things, and use that as an economic development incentive. There's also one called a 312 exemption. Those were up for renewal and got renewed in the last legislative session. That's city and county taxes. So there's a big push to get rid of these. Liberals want to get rid of them because they think they take money out of schools. Conservatives increasingly are wanting to get rid of them because they don't want to reward corporate economic development from the kinds of corporations that are showing up in voting fights and fights over bathroom bills and things like that. So there's some real sort of political sand in this thing that wasn't there before. But the 313 exemptions are, they're still out there. We're getting to the point, there's 6 weeks left in a session. In practical terms, if you're sort of a mechanic, this, the last 2 weeks are sort of lost. If you're not, putting a bow on the package in the last 2 weeks, you don't have a package. So over the next month or so, we're going to find out which issues get through the gate. And I'm watching 313s very carefully. The same folks who are of a mind to, you've heard this argument, if Major League Baseball's going to pull an all-star game, maybe we should pull the economic incentives that built their stadiums. Maybe we should get rid of their tax exemption. That same kind of thinking goes into this 313 thing. And I think a tax deal that has been really useful to a lot of communities. There've been a couple of abuses, but it's been really useful to a lot of committees. I think that one's kind of on the bubble. That's an example. There are always things that you're sitting there at the end of a session and a bill pops up that you go, oh my, that you've never heard of before. And I still haven't heard of all of those yet. I'm looking.
Well, let's we've got about 10 minutes left, so let's get some attendee questions. And our first question is from Tony Kimmy with LJA, and Tony is our Public Policy Council Chair. And Tony, the floor is yours. Tony, your mic's off. All right, well, Tony, let's come back to you. I see we've got a question from Dev Rastogi with AECOM. Dev.
Hey, Ross, thanks for a terrific presentation. And my question's perhaps not necessarily relevant because I do understand that House Bill 35 was pulled in committee, but a number of folks on this call are always engaged in projects that expand the community, and bond elections are particularly important in North Texas. And so I'm just really curious what was behind the thinking in limiting or potentially limiting bond elections to November. And do you see this as something that we should be looking for in the future?
The political conventional wisdom, how's that for a hedge? The political conventional wisdom on things like this, school board elections, bond elections, city council elections, and those kinds of things, is that they're low turnout elections and only activists vote. And, depending on the community you're in, that can make an election result more conservative or more liberal than you think the general population is. And one way to get at that or to change that is to move it to higher turnout elections in November. Bond elections particularly come under the microscope on this, because if you have an informed electorate, I'm going to do this gently. I'm not calling voters stupid, but I am calling a lot of voters ignorant about some of the issues that they vote on, especially as they get way, way down on the bottom of a ballot. If you get an informed electorate that's really into whatever the school district is trying to do, or the city's trying to do, or whoever's putting out the bonds, you might get a different result than if you're asking an electorate that is generally against the size or cost of government and doesn't necessarily know the particulars of an issue with a city or a school district. So maybe we want to build, 7 new campuses for our school district, and it's going to cost $1 billion. And so we put a $1 billion bond issue out for these 7 school districts. And if I know it's for those 7 school campuses rather, and if I know it's to build schools, I might vote for it. But if I don't know exactly what it's for, and I just see the government acting for more money, I might vote against it. I'm going to get more of the second kind of voters in a general election than I would in an election in May or September. Was that politic enough? Was that?
Yeah, that's helpful. I guess, do we see this as something that will come up again, likely, even though it was pulled at this point?
Yeah, I think this is the same kind of populist conservative politics, and I'm not speaking for it or against it. It's just the same kind of populist conservative politics that you see in legislation like the taxpayer-funded lobbying legislation, where they're against cities or school districts joining associations or hiring lobbyists to talk to the legislature. Why am I paying taxes to somebody to go lobby somebody else I'm paying taxes in for more money? That's the argument. And that issue's been a perennial. I think this issue is probably a perennial as well.
Thanks, Deb, for your question. All right, Tony, let's try you again. Tony Kemme with
Okay,
LJ.
can you guys hear me?
We hear you.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, Ross, great summary. I appreciate your time today. This has been very helpful. Last legislative session, we passed some school finance funding and also funding for mental health, all of that out of rainy day funds. I was always very concerned about this upcoming legislation that we're in right now, because, that was, again, paid for through our savings account. Any movement or any discussion about trying to permanently fund some of the strides we made last session?
One of the things that they were talking about in the legislature as they came in and were thinking that, this was going to be a very tight budget, the line everybody was on, Republicans, Democrats, fat kids, skinny kids, kids that climb on rocks, was that they were not going to make cuts in the 2019 changes they made to public education. They came in, if you remember the 2018 elections, one of the primary motivators for voters in that election was, you're not doing right by education, you're not doing right by the schools. And a lot of Republicans on that 2018 ballot, Dan Patrick, Ken Paxton, Sid Miller, people like that, had very narrow victories. It scared the devil out of them. When they came into the 2019 session, rewrote public education, school financing, and obligated the state to, this complicated, what they call a compression formula, where they basically said, one of the problems has been a creep in a rising share of public education costs going to local taxpayers and a shrinking cost going to state taxpayers. We see a little bit of that this year because it's a vestige of the old law that state property values are way up. State property taxes for public education are up about $5.5 billion. And that's $5.5 billion that, because of the old formulas, the state won't be spending on public education this year. So there's still a little vestige there. The question is, when it comes time for the state to not have that balancing mechanism, when local numbers go down, will the state numbers go up, and where's that money going to come from? It's a great question, and they don't have an answer for it. And the question going forward is, how are you going to finance that? And is it going to come out of some other part of the budget, or are you going to have to come up with some other way to make money around here? Now we're back to casinos and legalizing weed and hoping the feds send us a bunch of money for Medicaid.
Thanks, Tony, very much. Ross, you raised legalizing marijuana. What's your take on all that?
I don't think Texas is ready to do this yet. I didn't think Oklahoma was ready either, but there you go. You guys are closer to Oklahoma than I am. I'll just, I might visit you. This has gotten popular in a lot of states. If you watch markets, this is interesting. I read a story this morning, might have been the Wall Street Journal, but I read a story this morning that in Canada, where they legalized pot, the makers and distributors are still having a hell of a time making any money on it, believe it or not. And, it's difficult in the United States because money from legal sales of marijuana is not allowed to go anywhere in the national banking system. It's against federal banking law. So there's a lot of problems with that. I think the Texas legislature is going to let everybody else be the guinea pig on this. It's going to wait a while. I think it would be very difficult to get that legislation through this particular legislature.
Thanks very much, Ross. I think we've got time for one more quick question, and I'm going to turn that over to Ken Malcolmson to ask our last question.
Well, I can't believe you're doing that, Jeff, because I have 8 questions. So,
well, choose your best one.
Yeah, Ross, how about just weigh in a little bit more expansively on this whole issue around municipal autonomy and the angst associated with state versus municipalities?
One of the arguments about the governor's emergency powers, as you guys well know, is, to what extent can he order the closure of certain businesses? The whole argument over essential and non-essential businesses, the argument over everything from hair salons to bars to restaurants, it's just a politically fraught subject. And we went through this this thing where whenever the coronavirus was surging and people were had gotten newly cautious and more worried about the disease, the governor's shutdowns were popular. And whenever the disease faded a little bit, or the surges flattened out a little bit, the business interests or the interests that wanted the freedom to open their business were pressing forward. It's a heck of a place. The governor found himself never winning with everybody. And actually, this experience was probably mimicked in most of the other states. How do you balance that, and how do you go forward? One of the things that came up in that, to get to your question, is if the governor isn't closing businesses, should Clay Jenkins or Eric Johnson be able to do that? Can Betsy Price close things down? And the arguments. I mean, it's a very, very difficult thing. A friend of mine at the very beginning of the pandemic said, this is going to be one of those problems where you have three alternatives or three things that you have to balance. One of them is civil liberties, one of them is commerce, and one of them is public health. And you can only balance two at a time, which was a really interesting way to think about it. And if you kind of watch the year go by, you could see them trying to find their way through this. The cities wanted to have the ability to say, you set a statewide policy, and when we are outliers, we should be able to set our own policy. But I think partly informed by this ongoing battle between the state's authority stops here and the city's stops there, or the county's stops there. We had a lot of argumentation about that, and I think we're still having it today. I think the state wants much more control over these things, much less patchwork stuff from county to county. When you cross the Dallas-Collin County line, the whole legal network changes, those kinds of problems. On the other hand, Republicans have long been the party that said, the government that's closest to the people is the best government. So it's a conundrum. And I think it's a rolling problem. And there's a bunch of legislation that's around that this year. And if nothing else, is proof that they haven't settled the argument.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you, Ross. And we are past our 3 o'clock deadline on this, so we're going to go ahead and close this program out. Ross, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been educational and informative and fun, and we really appreciate you enlightening us on your thoughts on the session. I'm going to turn it back over.
I'm flattered to be invited back. You guys take care.
And you will be invited. But before you go, I want to turn it back over to Charles to close it out, because he does want to recognize you.
Well, I just want to say thank you very much, Ross, and for joining us again. And we'll hope that at some future time you will join us yet again. And so I'll just say, on behalf of all the sponsors of this opportunity, we're grateful for everyone joining in. I don't know, Jeff, Ken, you have any closing words?
Yeah, Charles, thanks so much. And Ross, in your honor and in honor of all of our speakers for this series and our other programs, we'll be making a donation in your name to the Austin Street Shelter up here in Dallas. And
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, you appreciate you taking the time to do this.